Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Mixed Mental Arts. I make a point to emphasize the mental because Brian Callen repeatedly refers to this podcast as mixed martial arts. So it's important to make these distinctions and just make it clear what this podcast is. It is my great pleasure to bring on this show a man that I've talked about before and stolen many ideas from, because that's how idea sex works. Often it's based on theft. Gross. Yeah, that really is so uncomfortable. Can we just edit this out and start again? And by the way, just so that we're clear, Kate Fogarty is also in the room, so there's a level of other uncomfortableness. This actually reminds me of something that you talked about in terms of when we were doing the Culture Matters things. You talked about Revenge of the Nerds.
Yeah.
Yeah, tell that story.
Just
Dave.
about how awful it is?
Yeah. Well, but also the ways in which you look back at it and you're like, oh, this thing that I thought was so innocent is actually...
Oh, yeah. The fact that Revenge of the Nerds, when you watch it, like my parents were like, this is the funniest movie. You have to see it. And you watch it now and it's... I mean, there's the famous rape scene on the moon thing, which is clearly horrible. There's a really for fun played scene where they are doing a panty raid at a sorority house. They steal their underwear. They look at them naked. They put in video cameras in everyone's room. And then they have a 12-year-old child sit and watch it all night. And that's not counting the tricycle race, where they drink 20 beers in under an hour. Totally and utterly validated and supported by the university.
So the point is that I've been idea raping Dave for a long time, and now I want to make it much more consensual and have back and forth idea sex and give Dave all the credit that he deserves for being a brilliant observationalist of culture. Observationalist is not a word. And then also just to give some context on who Dave is. This is, by the way, the worst intro that any human has ever
strong.
done.
I don't think you've said my name yet.
So Dave's name is, well, that's where we get really fun, Dave Colan.
Yes.
But so Dave is at Second City, the legendary improv studio.
That's right. I've been working with Second City since 2003. If you're not aware of what Second City is, it's the big improv theater in Chicago that started comedy. Let's just leave it there.
But, well, who are the famous alumni of...
The list goes on, but in terms of really recognizable ones, you've got Colbert, Farley, Belushi, Tina Fey, Martin Short, everybody on SCTV, Dan Aykroyd, even back to Mike Nichols and Elaine May,
wow.
who nobody even knows who they are anymore.
I do. I know Mike Nichols and Elaine May.
But I mean, most of your listeners...
probably don't, but that's because most people aren't culturally stuck in the 1960s and 70s.
I'm 50s.
50s, yeah.
No, they're 60s. They're 60s.
Yeah, 60s, yeah. In general, I have a weird frame of pop cultural reference because growing up in the UK, the latest shows would be from the 1980s. So I grew up watching Cheers. I have a weirdly encyclopedic knowledge of Cheers.
I went to Thailand in 1997 and it was 1997 and they had just gotten the 70s Hulk. And one of my guides just wanted to talk about it. He was so into it.
Did you see the latest episode of the Hulk?
He was like, that show is great.
So you've been teaching at Second City for how long?
I teach improv. I don't know when I taught my first improv class, but I've been teaching improv since about 2002. Mm-hmm. I teach at Second City now, but I've been teaching on and off, also writing, performing, going on the road, doing all sorts of things, not being as rich and famous as Brian Callen, who, as I understand from listening to this podcast, we're required to pay homage to at the beginning of every episode.
And periodically throughout the episode.
Yes.
Nate McCabe, who's working on the belt system, has just been talking about how he really wants to build the cult of personality of Brian Callen. And I feel like some people, this is already the basis of a sectarian rift within Mixed Mental Arts, where some people are very much down for building the cult of personality of Brian Callen, and then there are going to be some apostates who reject Brian Callen and recast him as Satan.
It's not about the divinity of Brian Callen. It's about the message as a whole. You're trying to make a god out of one man when I'm just trying to carry on the message.
Yeah. Well, but that's the point, is to use the man to deliver the message. And I think, just to briefly acknowledge, the whole point of the cult of personality is that inevitably, and when any movement starts, there's a question of who the leader is. And so the point is, you guys are going to ask this question here. We're going to give you a mock leader to fixate on. And then, we're going to make that into a joke so that it becomes clear that we're not actually saying that this figure is the actual leader.
What you really need
Yeah.
is somebody make you some amazing Brian Callen artwork. Like
That's what I want.
We need the Brian Callen Sistine Chapel with him touching your finger.
See, that's what I want. I think, mock cults of personality, I think there are a few things more fascinating. Like, I've sort of been playing around with them for my whole life. So in college, for example, I was in the freshman musical and, got cast as the sort of the villain or the bad guy.
What musical?
No, it was a student-written freshman musical. So it was literally the worst piece of theater ever done in history. And I ended up, they'd given me this character, and rather than doing sort of the boring, bland character, I was just like, I'm going to make this a composite of every South American dictator ever. So there was that. And then I started a house war between like the different dorms, where I recast my dormitory as, it's called Mather, and I recast it as Mathergrad and used all the Soviet iconography.
This was unrelated to the musical. You just
unrelated. There's a weird obsession in my mind with, I find cults of personality and the symbology and all of that builds up around any movement. I find that fascinating.
I find just the general concept of movements like pretty amazing. Like people just decide to cling together. Like the tribes thing is fascinating to me. Yeah. I went to the University of Wisconsin, and in the student section in the football games, the student section is O and P. I think there's a few other, but those are the two main ones. And you just sit where you get. It's random. It's not assigned seating. It's you sit wherever you sit. Those two sections fight every game for the whole game. They have chants about each other. Yeah. And 1 week you're in P, 1 week you're in O, it doesn't matter. But they it's the funniest thing ever. And they just hate each other and fight throughout the entire game.
And that is, that's so in college they had originally the dorm system. You chose to be in a dorm, but then they randomized it. But the amazing thing is that even though they've randomized it, still there are these strong dorm identities. Yeah. And they're, in many senses sort of Mather was the jock dorm. And, even though I am not a jock, that jock culture persisted for decades and decades in many senses. And there is this sort of it's of all the dorms, it's the most sort of Animal House, where, there was a lot of pranks and a lot of all of that sort of behavior. And that sort of reminds me of American Nations, where they talk about the doctrine of first effective settlement, where even though, say, New York was settled by the Dutch, and then the Dutch, the culture is lost, the language is lost, but those cultural values persist and persist and persist. Anyway, the point is that, humans are super tribal, and we constantly are inventing tribes, even around things as arbitrary as O and P.
For those of you who are playing the Mixed Mental Arts bingo game, we have referred to the Dutch now.
So let's talk about the Mixed Mental Arts bingo game. So there's a bingo game that somebody invented on Twitter.
Is that real?
Oh yeah, no, there's a real Mixed Mental Arts bingo game.
I didn't know it was real.
Oh, no, there's the 100 Mots drinking game, which is based around how many times I say right, all that sort of thing. And the whole reason that Rupert in Norway invented Rupert's Challenge, which is to see if I can go a whole day without saying is because he said, I want to play the 100 Mods drinking game, but I don't want to die. Right. So some reasonable level of inebriation, that's what we're aiming for with my verbal tics.
Yeah, mentioning the Dutch, I think, is a big one.
It's a big one.
Yeah.
But this is also part of the reason why we're now getting people like Dave and like Kate on the show, is so that we can move away from Hunter and Brian and start to have much more of a community and have different voices. Because why do I talk about the Dutch constantly? Because I'm trying to figure this thing out, right? I'm trying to figure out my own cultural baggage, and it's unfair to inflict my personal therapy session on the world.
The thing about your Dutchness that keeps coming up for me is how, for me, it's that kind of weird thing about sex where you keep saying idea sex and idea orgy, and it gets gross and uncomfortable pretty fast for me. I don't know for everybody else, but for me, when it's the three of us are going to get together and have an idea threesome. And I think the Dutch thing is you're just this is fun. Yeah. Does nobody else, I don't recognize that anybody's uncomfortable about this.
Well, since Kate Fogarty is in the room, Kate has also expressed, can we call it something other than idea sex? So I think the point is, Dave, is I think that you are probably in the majority, and like so many things, I am in the minority. And that's, again, why we're, broadening this thing out from being the Brian Callen Show with Hunter Motz to being Mixed Mental Arts, is so that it doesn't just become Brian and my weird neuroses. So anyway, I think we started off Kate's episode with her cultural confession. So I think it would be worth just sort of sharing your weird mix of cultural muttness with people.
It's weird. I'm less of a cultural mutt in a lot of ways, I think, than other people are. But I did wind up being very much of a cultural mutt in some ways. I grew up in Alabama. My father is from the Midwest, so his family goes back 9 generations in the Midwest. My mom's family goes back 9 generations or 10 generations in Alabama. There are plantation owners in my mom's background. I don't know anything about my dad's background. I think every single one of them was a farmer until they started having buildings. But from this old Southern family, my grandparents, as opposed to being part of the Old South, which they were civil rights activists, and they stood up and bailed Rosa Parks out of jail. They were friends with Rosa Parks. And so growing up in the South, I had this weird double aspect of both being part of the Old South in terms of who my family is and having people who knew who they were, but also at the same time being very much an outsider. And also, our family connections were Old South, but my grandmother's personal connections were civil rights, which were 2 very different things. And then in the middle of all that, we just moved to Wisconsin. And then I lived in a mostly Jewish neighborhood in Wisconsin and wound up being a totally outsider in a place that I had no background and no connection, and just moved around a lot, mostly in the Midwest, but I've lived in Chicago and LA and the South. And it's just been very strange. It's a very strange thing to not really belong any of the places. Like I've never had that tribe either. Like I never had that, like, oh, this is totally who we are and we've always been this way.
Right.
So I don't trust, actually, if we're having psychology, I still find them fascinating, but there are very few tribes I trust.
Well, and I think that's the point. I think there's good reasons not to trust them. Because obviously, large organized movements have done some pretty terrible things in history. I mean, the track record on human groups is definitely mixed at best. And the challenge, and this is part of what, we sort of now have to deal with, and what Kate and I were talking about post-podcast, was how do we build a community that doesn't devolve into some sort of shitty orthodoxy or that doesn't become problematic?
I can answer that.
Good.
I have an answer for that.
Do it.
Bad news.
What?
It's impossible. And this is, I read an article about this years ago. It's not the only place, but it's my first year of SNL theory of human groups, which is a group of people driven by an idea, create something that they believe in, like the first season of SNL, in a place that nobody wants. You go, late night on Saturday night. It's supposed to be a Johnny Carson rerun, but Johnny Carson doesn't want to do them anymore. So you get a group of people together. They make the show. They don't think anyone's going to watch it, so they do whatever they want. And lo and behold, it's popular. And these people get an intense connection, and they all sleep with each other, and they do drugs with each other. I'm hoping that doesn't happen here for us. But they become intensely close. They create this movement. The movement is people who are dedicated to the work and the ideals, and then it starts making money or gaining power. And all of a sudden it goes from, I love comedy, I want to work on SNL, to, I like being a star, I like being rich. And you go from the first couple seasons of SNL to the Eddie Murphy years, which are great, but at that point SNL goes from like, what can we do that's subversive? What's funny? And they go to, who can be on a sitcom? Who can we make a movie around? And SNL, while I still like it, I have friends on it, it's great, it's not, at some point it becomes part of the orthodoxy. At some point you're suspending writers for making fun of Donald Trump's kid rather than being like, F you, that's what we do.
Yeah. Well,
and so if you get popular enough, if this gets powerful enough, it will become the Catholic Church. And
the point is for it to then be disrupted again.
Yes.
But so I think it's possible to create something, but the point is that you're not there's no end solution, right? You need to constantly be disrupted and have the breaking up and the turning over of groups.
Thomas Jefferson would have overthrown our government 7 times between 1776 and now if he'd been able to be alive the whole time.
Now, also, though, Dave, let's talk about how your own honor culture intuitions might be filtering this conversation. So do you think that some of this is that honor culture distrust of authority?
It's interesting because I think honor culture trusts authority up to a point, as long as they are a member of the group. Yes, I think that there is some degree of a distrust of authority, but at the same time, like in honor culture, I mean, even in the improv community, the people who latch onto the community trust the leaders of the community as long as they stay within the orthodoxy. And that's where you get the problems. That's where you get to the point of like, one of the things my grandfather, who was a pretty amazing guy, always said was that if Jesus Christ ever came back to earth, the Christians would kill him.
Oh, without a doubt.
But it wouldn't be anyone else. It would be the Christians. He would challenge the orthodoxy of the Christian religion and be an enemy immediately.
But see, I think that's the interesting thing is that there's the challenge is orthodoxy. To me, that's the problem when it moves from the Steve Jobs The Lost Interview, which I've been referencing a lot because it's what I'm currently enamored of. But he talks about how most things, when you really sort of start to ask why we do these things, you find out that they're folklore and that these are just sort of cultural prejudices that have set in. And so the point is that sort of orthodoxy and that sort of folklore will set in. And then you have to constantly disrupt that orthodoxy and be empowering people who are asking why, so that you're revealing constantly what is just folklore and what makes sense. Because there are things that, people ask me where I can give them a fairly good I can explain to them why I came to this conclusion, and they're satisfied. And then there are a lot of things where they ask me why, and I can't actually tell them. And I think that's what we need is that it's really grounding the group around why is the most important question. And the more we're all asking each other why, I think that's how we potentially do a little bit better than has been done in the past in terms of orthodoxy.
So here's a question about that. I had something else I was thinking about, but I want to challenge that for a second, because I think the people who ask why are important, but I don't know that you can build a movement with just the people who ask why.
No.
You eventually need the people who are going to rationalize the orthodoxy and create it to pass it around to people, and that's where any movement and whatever it is has to be destroyed again from the outside. My question for you is there any movement that challenges itself from the inside?
Consistently?
Yeah.
I think that's how science began, but I don't think that's where science is.
I mean, you and I have talked a lot about atheism, which I like to think that to some degree our conversation about atheism led to your tremendous Twitter mistake, needless crusade. I am an atheist. I do not believe in God, and I despise most atheists because for me, I don't believe in God. It's okay. I don't need to talk much about it. It's interesting that people believe in God. There's things that churches or religions give people, and you and I talked about that, and that there's an atheist orthodoxy, which is not just that like there is no God. Okay, fine, but that the belief in God is the core of all of our problems. And I know many atheists who believe that's the core of all our problems, and that's just ridiculous to me.
Well, to me, it's a cargo cult. So there's this tendency to build these cargo cults where it's like, oh, this thing is the solution or the cause of all of our problems. And if we could only get rid of this one thing, all of our problems would be solved. And so it's, very much like libertarianism, the anarcho-capitalist strain of libertarianism. And, you've had amazing conversations on Twitter with Britton Cocker.
If you're listening, Britton, and this is where it gets gross, if we're having idea sex, me and Hunter are just tag teaming you.
But I think that's the interesting thing is that there's the question of do I or do I not believe in God? And that's one thing. And I think that, again, just to, make sure that everybody's getting drunk, to relate this to the Dutch, the Dutch have this idea of gedogen, which is what Dutch tolerance is. It's not really tolerance. It's like you turn a blind eye to it. So you're sort of indifferent. And so this is an attitude that developed out of the religious wars, where you're like, we fought each other for 80 years over Calvinism versus Catholicism. Let's just agree to disagree, right? Who cares? It's not the important thing. There are more important things. So, and in the same way, people have asked me, what do I believe? Do I believe or not believe in God? I actually don't care. It's a profound apathy to the question of God. But where I have a real problem is when you then have the cargo cult of, if only we could get rid of God, then the idea of God, all of our problems would be solved. Because I don't think that's the source of all of our problems, and I don't think that the data bears that out.
And it doesn't make any sense. And I kind of agree with you. Like, when I get to my personal stuff about God, the idea of whether or not God exists is moot. You just had a whole thing on quantum mechanics, and great. There's an unknowable, vast source of energy of which almost anything is possible, and there may be multiple dimensions where everything happens. So, great. Explain to me how that's not at least some version of what we think of as God. But right, to say that like religion is the problem is poor people, it's uneducated people, it's people joining together in big groups to oppress other people. It's just what we do. Yeah. Chimpanzees who don't have any religion will just murder another tribe of chimpanzees, and not even because they're starving or anything, just because like in the long run, it's better for their descendants to be the only chimpanzees in the valley. And that's us to some degree. We'll do it with God. We'll do it with not God. We'll do it, we'll do it over a basketball team or a baseball team. Well,
and certainly over a football team in the UK.
Yeah.
They like to gloss motherfucker, So there's I think a large part of, and Kate and I were talking about this after the last podcast, what is mixed mental arts about? And I don't now want to create an orthodoxy, but I think a large part of what we all sort of recognize is that there is this thing called human nature, and that's the real problem. The real problem is that, we have this Dunbar number problem, which means that most people to us are an abstraction. We have this Descartes' error problem where thinking and feeling are always linked, and we're often just rationalizing our feelings and our prejudices. We have this problem of power where absolute power corrupts absolutely, and then you have to develop checks and balances. And the question is, how stuck with the human nature that we have, how do we develop a more productive, a more inclusive society than the one we currently have?
Yeah. And as the worst example in the terms of the nerdiest example of all of this, in the improv community, people will occasionally get really upset over fights over long form versus short form improv. And for those of you who don't know what the difference is, long form improv is like a 30-minute improvised show with one suggestion. Short form improv is whose line is it anyway? And literally people get mad at each other and fight. There are 4 or 5 major schools in LA and many more smaller schools in the LA, improv schools in the LA area. People will fight over which improv theater is the best.
Yep.
And it's always the one they go to, and it's irrelevant in every way. But yeah, people will absolutely just cling on to like, this is literally just the first place I decided to pay for classes. And now everybody who paid for classes their first time at a different place is the biggest idiot I've ever met.
Well, and that's human tribalism.
Right.
And, it goes to your O&P thing. And what that makes me think of is Jonathan Swift and the Little Enders and the Big Enders.
Right.
And so in Gulliver's Travels, there's Lilliput and Blefuscu, which are these 2 islands. And they have the same holy book, which is Al-Quran, based on, obviously, the Quran.
Whoa! I never made that connection.
Blown. Knowledge bomb dropped. And it's the same prophet. But in the book, he says that all true believers must eat the egg from the convenient end. And so then they're like, convenient end? Which is the convenient end? And half of them decide that it's the little end of the egg, and the other half decide it's the big end of the egg. And then these 2 factions develop called the Little Enders and the Big Enders. And, they have great wars and all of that. And that was actually not based on religion. That was based on politics, where I think it was the Whigs and the Tories in Swift's time. But that's what humans do. We create tribes, and they're usually over stupid differences. And the question is just how do you manage that tribalism and have more productive relations and, better And now, see, that's the point. There's the possibility that a rift develops around the idea of idea sex, right?
Right.
Like,
You and me. I am the I'm the Luther of this movement. I'm going to form the Protestants.
See, but that's what's so funny is I thought I was the Luther, and
No.
now there's a Luther to
Brian
the Luther.
Callen and you're just, I don't know, one of you's John the Baptist. The other thing I love about this podcast is you went into the Jonathan Swift thing for a while. You could have also just referenced the Sneetches from Dr. Seuss. The Sneetches with stars on them. Do you not know the Sneetches?
I don't know the Sneetches.
It's easier and quicker.
Okay,
It's just,
do it.
it's Dr. Seuss. There's these things called Sneetches, and a guy shows up and he can put stars, or some of them have stars on their stomach and some of them don't. And the ones with stars are better than ones without stars. And the whole story is some guy shows up with a machine and he can put the stars on you or take them off you as necessary. So when he puts the stars on everybody, the old born with star Sneetches take theirs off, and then it becomes more powerful to not have stars. And then eventually all the Sneetches have stars all over them.
Well, there you go.
And you could have referenced that too. And the fact that you know Jonathan Swift and can remember the names of the tribes and stuff, but you don't know the Sneetches is how profoundly alien you are in many ways.
Well, but this is what part of what Kate and I were talking about is my profound alienness, in the sense that I write these 5,000 word blog posts. Yeah.
I've never finished one.
Yeah. Well, that would put you in the majority of humanity again. So just the degree to which I'm in the minority, and the point is that I can take the science and move it a certain direction.
Right.
And then now the baton has to be passed. And it's time for people like Kate has been doing these awesome knowledge bombs that are 500 words or less and actually relatable. And then, you have the ability to work this into comedy and music and stories. And that's the goal. The goal is I'm just one more link in the chain.
Sure. And we all are. I mean, that's the idea, is getting this out. I mean, this is the tipping point. I forget which one you are. You might be the Maven. I forget exactly which one it is, but the guy who has all the information, but he needs people who know how to get it out.
Exactly.
And that's you. You've gathered a lot of stuff. I'm telling you, the first hour or first 3 hours, first time you meet Hunter, for the first 3 or 4 hours, fascinating stuff. Blows your mind. The second time it's 3 hours, it's good, but you start going, what's going on with this guy? And then the third time, you have to have a talk afterwards. And then it gets better again. But
I think that's also part of the reason why it's helpful to bring Dave and Kate into this conversation, to start to bring more people in, is that Brian Callen never... No, that's not true. Brian Callen did challenge me on the whole Sam Harris Twitter war thing.
Yeah, because I think he's right. In the long run, that was a terrible idea for your career.
Well, what I realized, it was again, I'm gonna just get people more drunk here, but it was, at least I tell myself it was Dutch. It was that bluntness, but maybe it was just me. But I was talking to Brian Atoya today, who is sort of working on some of the marketing for this stuff. And anyway, he's awesome. But again, I connected with him through this. But we were talking about this, and I was like, what I did is, in the intellectual Game of Thrones, I made enemies before I had allies.
Right.
Which was so not very smart.
But let's get to this in terms of you talking about building a movement out of this.
Yeah.
Which is still super megalomaniacal and insane, and to some degree. And I can't wait till you actually become the dictator, because for all you want out of this, you are going to eventually just be wearing the big mustache and the permanent military outfit with 1 million medals on it.
And then, like Gaddafi, die with my own gold pistol up my ass, right?
Oh, God. I forgot where I was going to go. Oh, yes. This is part of it, though. You want disruptors. So you went on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I listened to that. And that's a great place for you to get out your message. And he dug you, man. He was ready to put you back on. And maybe he still is. But you disrupted that pretty hard. And that's kind of part of the issue, when you're talking about what the culture you're trying to raise up. I mean, before any of the other books you read or any other fables, it really comes down to the Emperor's New Clothes. Mm-hmm. I've always thought, the old, everybody knows the fable, the Emperor's New Clothes. They make invisible, they don't make any clothes. They pretend to make them clothes and say, people aren't good at what they do, don't see the clothes. They parade it around. It takes the wisdom of a child to convince the audience that he's actually not wearing any clothes. And I have a strong theory, and years and years and years ago in a much too dramatic journal thing I wrote when I was like 15 years old. But when I first started thinking about this, I don't think that everybody looks at that kid and goes, you know what? He's right. I think that kid gets beat. I think that kid gets beat because everybody's got way too much invested in the fact that he's got clothes. And that is part of the thing about trying to create a disruptive movement is you've got to attract disruptors, or you've got to be willing to like not talk about how much you dislike Sam Harris for a little while on the show of somebody who really likes him or something like that, you know?
To be fair, I didn't do my homework. I didn't understand the degree to which Joe liked Sam Harris.
Right.
So that was not clear to me. And part of it was that, I'd sort of been focused on like so much of what my issue is that, and this is something that I got from my father, not because he's Dutch, but just because of my father.
But everybody's listening is drunk now.
Yeah. But, my father has always been obsessed with books and obsessed with ideas. And the problem is that he has strong nutty professor tendencies where he figures things out theoretically and then just sort of rolls with them.
Sure.
And that's definitely a habit and a tendency I have, where I had been thinking for a long time about, okay, so there's this problem of fundamentalism, there's this problem of fundamentalism. How do you deal with that? I'm not okay with the use of violence. Oh, I'm going to use teasing. And then I'm like, great, I'm going to pick out. And then I'm like, oh, but you're going to have this problem of fairness where it doesn't seem symmetrical. So I'm going to use the South Park principle. Like, this is all a problem that I'm trying to figure out. And either I should have workshopped it more with other people before going out and implementing it, or I shouldn't have implemented it at all and should have just focused on building alliances first.
Well, this is where, though, I talk about what I was saying at the beginning. You were thinking about forming alliances. Mm-hmm. And that's the question. Like, that dude's got a lot of listeners. Mm-hmm. And if he's on your side, cool. But that also means that maybe your message has to change a little bit. Yeah. And that's the essence of any movement building up is you need to either attract all of your own followers who will eventually become committed to the orthodoxy of your movement and start, fighting over whether or not you were God or just a man and whether or not you were God or the son of God or whatever it is. Or you need somebody to show up and say, great, I've got this platform. Here you go. By the way, while you're stepping up here,
here are the things you can and can't say.
Ixnay on imic clay, change clay. That's not how you say it. But there comes a point where it's like, but here's the requirements to entry. Here's my sacred cows that you can't address.
Right. And I think that, I think there's a few things that I want. And, these are just my personal desires. But, and I'm aware that, part of it is that in order to build a sort of large coalition, which is you need to build a large coalition to actually affect any change, right? So in order to build a large coalition, and that's part of what we're going to find out, there are going to be compromises, and you're going to have to figure out what to compromise on or what not to compromise on, and what are the the point is I don't know how to deal with it, but for my personal thing, the core has always been to really start a conversation about culture, because it was always abundantly clear to me that culture mattered and that we weren't really talking about it, and that we weren't really talking about it in a substantive way where you're really getting down to what is this thing called culture? How do we pick it up? How does it drive our choices? So I think that's a thing that we can achieve, is to start that conversation.
Right.
Now, the question is what then emerges from that conversation, what sort of society or what choices or what decisions. And I think that I'm also aware of this problem that you're talking about with orthodoxy, which I think there's the problem of orthodoxy, and then there's also the problem that, people who are figureheads of movements deal with, where it then becomes about this mythical persona of them, that personality cult. And you don't want that, because I, obviously, having written The Straight A Conspiracy, not obviously because most of the world has not read it, but having written The Straight A Conspiracy, I'm abundantly aware of the problem of genius myths. So I think that's the challenge, is how do you, it really is like, how do you unleash the wisdom of crowds? Like, how do you have it, like the thing that I think about is the Toyota production system. That's sort of or hunter-gatherer tribes, where everybody is challenging each other, everybody is calling each other out, and that there is an emergent wisdom of the crowds. And we recognize that everybody has different information and different knowledge, and that there is solutions that emerge from everybody's perspectives being put in and challenges better than what any one individual would come up with. And so that's what I would like to evolve to, which is part of why we're now pivoting towards it, not being the Brian Callen and Hunter Mod show and being Mixed Mental Arts, and then now pivoting again to start to include more voices like you and Kate.
Well, that's great. I have, I don't know how interesting this is, because basically you and I are strategizing how you're going to
how we're going to.
Right.
I mean, I'm trying to, that's the point.
But how this whole thing is going to, turn into something. And I don't know how interesting a strategy meeting is. But there's one thing that I think you're still missing out, or in that conversation, which is like the mass, you need a mass of people,
Yeah.
And you ever gone bar hopping with like 10 people or 12 people?
Yes.
So again, I went to school in Wisconsin, the University of Wisconsin. There's a street called State Street. They don't have cars on it, so you just walk up and down it in huge groups. And there's a theory about the way humans work that I developed from just watching people hang out in those groups, which is that you're walking down the street, your friends stop for some reason. The whole group stops. You run into somebody as a group, and everybody stops to talk to them. But you're ready to go. And you have two choices. You can sit there in the mass of the group with the 12 people and try to convince all 12 people to go, or you can convince two other people who are absolutely really eager to go with you and just start walking with determination towards the next thing. And 60 to 70% of the time, your energy will cause the rest of the group to follow along. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, if you really want to create something, what you need is that group of 3 people who are like, we need to get to the next bar.
See, that was what I have been trying to do. Because for a long time, I've been trying to do this whole thing by consensus. And then I was like, great, I'm just going to go rush off. But then out of that emerged my Twitter war. So the point is, maybe I shouldn't have rushed off, and maybe I'm not the one to be rushing off. But I think that's very much...
You can't rush off alone.
Well, that's the problem.
That's the problem. You can't... If you just leave alone, everybody's going to go, where's Hunter going?
Yeah.
What the hell's... What's wrong with Hunter? I don't know. Is he mad? I don't know. Let him. He'll be fine. Let him cool off. What you got to do is you got to convince 2 other people to go down the street with you. And if one of them is Brian Callen, and this is the point where we have to say, everybody's going to follow him because he's so charismatic and good looking.
Thank you.
We're required to talk about this at some point.
Yeah.
This is where other podcasts do a commercial. We just sing Brian Callen's praises. You have to have 2 other people. So it's like, where are the 3 of them going? They got something going on.
Well, there's that great, I think it's a TED Talk or whatever, where they talk about, that the most important person in any movement is the second person.
Right.
And they show that video of that guy, and there's that lone guy on the hillside, and he's dancing, and he looks like a crazy man. But then as soon as somebody comes in and joins, now that is a valid activity, and therefore other people start rushing in to dance with the crazy man.
It's one of the things, this is an improv thing. I'm going to take it back to improv for a minute.
Do it.
I thought we were going to talk about improv this whole time, but it's okay that we're not. But one of the things that's about improv that I always tell people is, if somebody's doing something, join them. Because one person doing something alone is just like, oh, I wonder what that person's doing. If 2 people are doing the same thing at the same time, we think they've got something going on. And if you see 150 people doing the same thing at the same time, well, that's a Broadway musical. I mean, that's bigger than, that's a musical. That's a massive production. That's a flash mob. 20 million people watching on YouTube.
Yep.
And it's ridiculous as humans, again, because literally 150 people standing and picking their nose at the same time on Hollywood Boulevard would be an art installation. It would make everybody stop and try to figure out what the hell is going on. And it's just 150 people picking their nose.
Well, and I think that's the key thing is exactly. I think that part of this is part of what Kate and I were talking about too, is firstly, I think that's really the goal, is to get enough of a community. We don't need 1 million people to start this thing. We need those 3 people to go off, or whatever this group is at this point, to go off, build the website where it's all broken down, it's all super accessible. There are the Culture Matters videos. There is that core of content that is clear enough and accessible enough that people can come into the conversation. And then people will come into the conversation, and then you use that to, okay, now this is clear to you. Now you go make songs about this. You go make comedy about this. You go make videos and whatever else. and it's just a question of accreting more and more and more. But I think the key thing also is that this whole conversation has been about improv.
Sure.
Because I think that the nature of human history is that it is evolution, and evolution is about improv, where it's not that this is all massively planned out. It's that it's all about, Stephen Johnson has this book, Where Good Ideas Come From, and he talks about the adjacent possible, where there are the nature of innovation is that there's a set of technologies or a set of ideas that make possible that next step. And then you take that next step, and then from there's now a series of next steps. And this is very much like, Joe Henrich's building off of the Isaac Newton thing, where if I've seen further, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants/hobbits. So I think the point is that, we've all had our own paths, and we've all sort of been dealing with this thing of culture and trying to make sense of it with different experiences. And there is stuff that we bring to the party. And by bringing even a small group of people together, we can then innovate something that is good enough. It is this sort of what they talk about in Silicon Valley with agile development, where you're making a beta version, which from then you make version 1.0, and then from that you make version 2.0. So I think it's just that we have to build the best version we can now, and then if you build it, people will come.
Well, that's one of the things in improv that is profound in terms of the way it affects everything moving forward, is that I've learned from improv that a group of people with no map, with no plan, can, if they have the same common goal, will usually figure out a way to make it happen.
Yep.
Human history is just that over and over and over and over again. We have the same goal. We'll just get together. We'll just keep bouncing out ideas until it happens. And improv is totally that. I mean, it is totally like not figuring out how you're going to get there. You just keep going till you get to the place you want it to go.
Yep. And I think that's very much the goal for all of this, is that and that's very much what we've been doing. I mean, I had written 5,000 word pieces. I don't know exactly what happened in Kate's mind, but I'm guessing that she sort of saw a problem that needed fixing and didn't think that I was going to be the one to fix it. So, and you can chime in here, Kate, if you want to take my mic.
Sorry.
Well, here, I'll just vamp until Kate gets over here. Vamping.
Brian Colan.
I think you were talking about how Joe Rogan just noticed when he got bored.
Yeah.
And that was a time for switching it up. And so, not to be rude, but there were times where I was like, I'm not following all of this, and it's not going where I want, and I just want enough to read while I'm on the bus or whatever it is. And so that's what I did.
And the point is, that's not rude at all. At least, it's pretty hard to do anything that a Dutchman would find rude.
Right now, there are 19-year-olds puking all over their shoes right now,
By
waiting for us to talk about karate.
But I'm really excited that already probably we've killed off half of whatever group we have from alcohol poisoning. So yeah, I mean, I welcome that criticism, and I think the point is that I know, this was the working relationship that I had with Katie very much, which is sort of, it became very clear what I was good at and what I was bad at. And fortunately, we had a complementary skill set where it's like I went off, I read the science, I figured all that, I explained it in some sort of crude, inaccessible way that it was a little bit more accessible than what the science was, and then she would go in and she would edit and produce that story and harmonize it. And so I know what I do well and what I don't do well, and that's very much what Kate has done with what I've been handing her, is to shape it into something that's more usable and more accessible. And that's what I appreciate about you, Dave, as well, is that you're willing to call me out on my shit and make fun of me, and I think that's incredibly valuable.
Well, you're going to need somebody if you're really going to build a massive movement. You need somebody in it who's just going to knock you down.
I think I'll need a lot of people. Unfortunately, Twitter has proven itself to be very generous in terms of people who are willing to take me on.
They're not always good at it, though.
No.
That's the thing that drives me nuts
You're
about
much
Twitter.
better.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're much better. No, because you do it. I think that's the thing is that a really good jab. I think there's two things. One, it has to be specific. Right? You have to have really thought about the other person and figured out what is that log in their eye and gotten really precise with it. And then the other thing too is that, is to do it with charm, which is not the Twitter way.
Comedy, like, what's his name? The guy who does the roasts, Jeff Ross.
Mm-hmm.
He's probably one of the most, I'll bet you in real life, he's one of the most empathetic people you'll ever see, because he can look at you and figure out how to hurt your feelings so quickly and get to the core of like what your weaknesses are. And that's what that is part of it. And I'm not anywhere near that good, but I do enjoy every once in a while being like, did I actually hurt Hunter there?
Well, and I think actually this is, I was talking with Andrew Hunt about this. I mean, part of the whole Twitter war thing was that I had this metaphor of mixed mental arts. And so part of it was that I came up with this metaphor, and then I was like, what does that actually mean? Does that mean we're going to have bouts or fights? Should I be picking fights with people? And what came out of the conversation with Andrew is to realize that what does the intellectual Thunderdome look like? It probably looks a lot like a comedy roast, because a comedy roast is no holds barred. And that's just the space in which really everybody does an amazing job of calling each other out on their bullshit.
The other thing about it is one-sided.
Yeah.
The object of the roast does not, they get a reply at the end, but they don't even get to be defensive. They just get to fire back. And that's one of the big things about comedy roast, which I think is really profoundly actually amazing, is we're going to give you all the shit in the world and you can give a shit back, but you don't get to defend yourself. You don't get to talk about like why we're wrong or like why you're not dumb or why whatever. Like, you just have to take the shit. You have to sit there and listen to everybody go bean 400 times or taboo. And
Kate already did that one.
Did she do taboo?
Yeah.
No,
but it's clear that jokes at my expense don't get less funny when you do them more. So, but yeah, I think that's the thing, and I think that's the interesting thing. Is the intellectual Thunderdome, is it just comedy roasts? Are we just roasting each other?
I think it's a lot of things. I mean, like, to some degree, I think it's going to be that, but not always necessarily comedy. Like, maybe some of it will be funny, but some of it is just like, yeah, I mean, that's the scientific thing. Like, you put out your idea, and then everybody shows up and just kicks it in the nuts over and over and over again to see if it falls over.
Which I think is great. And I think
that's the new video series we need to have. It's just kicking your guests in the nuts over and over and over again to see if they fall over.
But I think that's, to me, there are certain core principles to me that, have sort of whittled down over time. One is, and it really all does sort of come down to the scientific principle, not necessarily the scientific establishment, but the idea that there is this thing called reality. It's out there. It exists outside of our minds. Our minds form projections of it all the time. Some of those projections are good approximations of the data, and some of them aren't. And then, per my conversation with Spiros, you actually need many theories of everything. So there are stories that you use to make sense of this and stories to use to make sense of that. And the point is that it's not that any one of these is true in the sort of the ultimate sense, but that they're all just ways of breaking down reality and making sense of reality to then be able to practically achieve things. And I think that's the key is, and part of what Kate and I were talking about with sexism in the last one, is just that these are all just stories, and what's useful? Does it achieve the result that we want? Is it helpful or not? And that should be the real test.
Sure. Although I'm not even sure what the real result of the end of this is, I think.
Well, I think it's improv. The point is we don't know.
Sure.
At some point we just go, scene.
Is that when we die?
Yeah, that is when we die. Or rather, the God not God says scene on our lives.
Right.
And like tags us out.
Exactly. And it's God, everybody. Anybody who's listening, it is for sure God.
Surprise, surprise. This is actually we've just been sneaking the God in.
He's real. He loves us.
And his name is Brian Colan.
And he is his one true son, and also God, and also the ghost of God, Brian Colan.
See, that's the thing. In our religion, Brian Colan is all three parts of the Trinity.
Sometimes, the other thing is, I have to say, I listen to these podcasts, and I kind of wonder, like, I think Brian Callen might not like me at all when I meet him.
Well, that would make him very much like God. Sometimes he's Old Testament and he's a vengeful God. Anyway, the point is that this has been an awesome conversation.
Thank you.
Kate, it was an awesome conversation. I was glad that you were able to step in and provide some clarity. And this is just a series of many awesome conversations that we hope to have. I know that Dave in particular is very excited to talk to not me, but Spiros Michalakis.
Oh my God.
Tell us about how much you want to talk to Spiros.
I literally, a year ago, I put out a thing on Facebook asking if anybody I knew a theoretical physicist I could talk to. And I've been emailing a guy who works at the Large Hadron Collider on and off sometimes to ask him physics questions, because when I'm not doing comedy, I read books about physics and just feel like a stoner. Like theoretical physics. It's fascinating to me, and I've got a million questions for that guy.
So I think we're going to have to set up some, but we can't call it, I mean, can we still call it, can I call it idea sex? Is that allowed?
It's going to make me gross.
Okay.
It's going to make me throw up in my mouth a little bit.
What would you prefer that we call this?
I don't know, just a conversation.
Okay, a conversation.
There's already a word for it.
Yeah, that is true. Well, and something that I find fascinating is that one of the words for conversation is, the old school is intercourse.
Right.
That's what they used to call it.
It's really your face. Like, here's the thing. Like, 90% of communication is nonverbal.
Yeah.
And it's the little gleam in your eyes when you say, let's have idea sex. Like, Hunter doesn't scare you in that sense of like, oh my God, he's going to beat me up or anything like that. Hunter scares you in the sense of like, he's going to invite you down to the next room, and all of a sudden you are going to find yourself in a situation you did not expect. You're just going to turn around and Hunter's going to be just kissing you lightly on your neck or something. This is how we do things. This is the Dutch way.
But that's the thing, is I'm such a shitty Dutchman. Like, I don't think that if this thing does take off, there are going to be a lot of Dutch people who are just going to be like, this man does not represent us at all. He doesn't speak the language particularly well. He doesn't.
I want to give your Twitter listeners a challenge right now. If you have anybody on Twitter, I want you to text us the definition of a shitty Dutchman, and not what it is in real life, like the sex act that is called a shitty Dutchman.
Oh my God. That's going to be the most listener engagement I've ever had.
Hashtag shitty Dutchman.
Well, there you go. I think we'll just end it on that note.
Join us next week on The Shitty Dutchman, formerly Mixed Middle Arts, formerly The Brian Callen Show.
Do you see? Already an insurgency has happened. Dave Colan has come on one podcast, and he's already taken it over and renamed it The Shitty Dutchman. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. Dave Colan, Second City teacher, and improv god. And I'm really excited to put you and Spiros together.
I can't wait. I don't even know I can handle the pressure of being recorded, because I feel like I'm going to talk to him. He's going to be like, no, that's stupid. I'm going to be like, oh, okay.
No, that's not Spiros' way.
No, I know, but my questions might be really stupid.
No, but that's not Spiros' way. Spiros is amazing at taking the shit that people hand him and turning it into Shinola. Like, he's very good at being like, oh, that's a very interesting question because blah, 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 blah. So I think that's the thing. It'll just be an amazing conversation.
Great.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, from the Shitty Dutchman, this has been Mixed Mental Arts.